Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're joined by Colonel Jacques Baud, former Swiss strategic intelligence official and author of countless books on both Russia and the Middle East. So welcome back to the program.
Thank you for inviting me again. Happy to be with you today, uh, even if it's a tragic day, let's
Yeah,
say.
so we both woke up this morning, I guess, noticed that United States had taken the very, I would say radical decision to attack Iran and attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. So I'm not sure how they're planning this out, how this is supposed to end. Again, Trump claimed that these facilities were completely and totally obliterated. I'm assuming he then also refers to Fordo. Um, so there's a lot to unpack here in terms of what has actually happened and how this will likely play out. But what do we know so far? Because I've seen some contradictory report that this attack on Iran was the spectacular success that Trump has presented it as.
We don't know all the details, but apparently what happened is that the US attacked this installation with Tomahawk cruise missiles and some deep penetrating bombs, but it's not exactly sure about this. In any case, what seems to have happened is that what has been destroyed are in fact surface installations, but there is no real impact on underground facilities that are in fact even too deep for those deep penetrating bombs that the US have. In other words, yes, it's spectacular, but it's not sure it was effective in terms of real impact. But I think the what is certain is that the installations that were attacked by the US were civilian installations. In other words, the US has attacked civilian nuclear installations. And that is, in fact, he repeats what Israel has done on the 13th of June when they started also to attack civilian nuclear facilities. And that's a breach of international law. I mean, attacking a sovereign country is already a breach, and attacking without any reason, because there is no reason for that. That's also important to underline, but probably will come on this later. But in addition to that, they attack nuclear civilian facilities. So it's technically it's closer to a terrorist act than to a military action. And that's very important because that means that the whole international order is shaken by this. You know, the purpose of IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is precisely to provide safeguards, monitoring, surveillance of nuclear activities in order to prevent such case. By, in fact, denying the IAEA it's the safeguards of the IAEA, the US has not only attacked physically civilian facilities, but it also attacked the international order. And I think that seems to me extremely important to mention. I mean, it's not the first time. Obviously, we had the experience of the Iraq War and things like this. But here we have definitely a blatant violation of international law that not even takes into account what the international the IAEA has said, that the Iran was not in on the path of producing a nuclear weapon. So therefore, there is no reason, no rationale for this. And that opens another door that we'll probably address later. It's the irrationality of decision making in the West. I mean, in Israel, but that's known for a long time. I mean, um, but also in the US. And what we have seen here, and especially I remember when Donald Trump, on his flight back to the US after the G7, he was asked by a journalist about Iran, and he mentioned that Tulsi Gabbard, in her presentation of the annual threat assessment in March this year, and Trump said, I don't care what she says, meaning that we have here also an institutional crisis within the US because the purpose, and I can talk about this because I used to be a strategic intelligence officer, and strategic intelligence, especially in a small country like Switzerland, very tiny organization. But the purpose of strategic intelligence is to advise the strategic decision making, meaning that essentially what you produce, the assessment you make, the intelligence you produce, because intelligence is a product, it's not information, it's a product. And this product is the basic element for decision making. And that guarantees the rationality, or should guarantee the rationality of decision making. When you say that you don't care about what your intelligence organization says, then that means that you you drift away from this institutional system which is provided by the intelligence organization. I'm also in the UN. I'm an expert in the rule of law and the reform of security institutions, and I always said that intelligence is a key element of the rule of law, in the sense that it provides decision making the kind of rationality you you need if you don't want to be kind of a banana republic. But what has US has demonstrated is that it acts as a banana republic, means without any rationale, just because the president thinks that way, then you should. That's it. It's exactly what Louis XIV in France used to say: "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. I decide. God and me, period. And we are exactly in the same dynamics here. And that's an evolution which is extremely worrisome. So, meaning that we have here we have, uh, um, a, let's say, criminal violation of international law. We have the destabilization of the international law order, and we have an institutional crisis within the US, in the sense that we have now a president that decides as he feels, not based on rational information and rational intelligence. So that this would be my first remarks regarding what happened in Iran.
Yeah, I think the direct quote by Trump, he was asked by a reporter, your intelligence agencies say there's no nuclear bomb being built. And he said, well, then my intelligence community is wrong. So again, as you said, he's above the intelligence community. He knows better. But it's not just the United States, though. Immediately after the attack, as you said, is as a case of nuclear terror that is bombing civilian nuclear reactors. This is yeah, really extreme stuff. And then the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, went out on Twitter and wrote, well, Iran is not allowed to have a nuclear bomb. And then, go on to the obligatory phrase of, we need de-escalation, as if, to hold on to the, I guess, pretense that the EU is still a peace project. But this is also shows a collapse, doesn't it? Of you mentioned of rules institutions, because the EU has not only provided not only tacit but very open support for the genocide in Gaza, and now, of course, yeah, offering this tacit support for what is effectively, as you said, nuclear terrorism. So, did you see a similar problem there in the European Union?
Absolutely, absolutely. We could expand the thinking beyond what I just said. You're perfectly right. I was not aware of the tweet of Kaika, which doesn't surprise me, in fact, because she's not the brightest light in the store, first of all, and second, we see that um, the EU basically has given up the whole diplomatic activity. There is no diplomatic activity. We have seen that, I mean, as you rightly said, in the conflict in Palestine, where EU is totally absent. We have seen the EU in the framework of the Ukrainian conflict, but only to provide weapons, not as let's say a peacemaker somehow, not as a bridge maker, but on the contrary, it's a wall builder and not a bridge maker or bridge builder, and not even in other conflict. I mean, we have other issues that have affected. I mean, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, we had also we still have the conflict in China, and we see the European Union is totally absent. But on the other hand, we have also to say that the EU has absolutely no credibility whatsoever. I mean, EU lacks intelligence, but not intelligence in the military sense, intelligence in the sense the brain. There is absolutely no brain, and Kaya Kalas is definitely not the best example of a person who is able to think. Sometimes you wonder how these people reach the position they have, but this is not the discussion here. What we see and from what you just mentioned about Kaikal is also another thing that we distorted the words. I mean, Iran has never claimed he wanted nuclear bomb. And in the discussion process that we have seen, and that was interrupted by the Israeli attack on the 13th of June, remember that last Sunday, the sixth round of negotiation was due in Oman. Now, in this discussion, the problem was not whether or not Iran should have nuclear weapons. Iran has said very clearly, first of all, it has signed the non-proliferation treaty. We have, if you read the agreement, the global strategic agreement between Iran and Russia, it stated explicitly that the Iran will continue to abide by the provision of the non-proliferation treaty, meaning that it means that even in this bilateral treaty, and it was clearly stated by Iran that there was no question having nuclear weapons. We know that the strategic doctrine of Iran doesn't include nuclear weapons. So there is the whole issue of the nuclear bomb is totally wrong. The whole issue and the reason why there was this difference between US and Iran was not about a nuclear bomb. It is about the ability or the right, in fact, to enrich uranium. And this right is explicitly, and if you read the JCPOA, for instance, Article 4 of the JCPOA, it states that it is based on the provision of the non-proliferation treaty. In the non-proliferation treaty, I think it's also an Article 4, or the other one is 1.4, and in the nuclear non-proliferation, it's Article 4. In any case, in the non-nuclear non-proliferation treaty, it's stated that the right to enrich uranium for civilian purposes is an inalienable right for every country. Inalienable. Therefore, why should Iran give up this inalienable right to enrich uranium since they have never, because Iran has never had a military nuclear program. Never. It made a study, a feasible study in 1988. It started a feasibility study named Project Ahmad, which was concluded in 2003 with the conclusion that Iran would there is no interest for Iran, or better said, it would be more a problem to have nuclear weapons than non having nuclear weapons, and therefore they gave up the idea of having nuclear weapons. But there's only a feasibility study and no program at all. In that case, you could even say that Switzerland had nuclear weapons because in Switzerland we planned to have nuclear weapons. We purchased a nuclear fuel for bombs. We purchased the Mirage 3 and modified the Mirage 3 to carry nuclear bombs, even in Switzerland. And eventually, we signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and we abandoned the project, although the project was officially abandoned in the early 90s in Switzerland. So the neutral Switzerland had a project to have nuclear weapons. And even if the project was abandoned well before it was officially terminated, we had this project for almost 30 years. So we Iran is a very similar situation. It made this study. Even the Swiss went further than the Iranians, in fact. This is the irony of the history. But so they made a feasibility, but they never had a nuclear program, a nuclear military program. Therefore, we continue to promote this narrative in order to find a weak point in Iran and to justify, in fact, activities or attacks such as the one that happened on the 13th of June and just yesterday by the US. And this kind of narrative is even disseminated further by people like Kaya Kalas, who has absolutely not the slightest, not even an atom of knowledge, which is totally stupid. And in fact, she just propagates propaganda. And as you rightly said, not even having some ethics in the politics, because they even reacted to all the massacres that have been made by Israel in Palestine, which is, in my view, a scandal in itself. But this is beyond the point today.
But I was also wondering how you see this escalating further, because in my opinion, one of the weaknesses of the United States is they haven't really adjusted properly to the loss of this very strong global primacy. Because in the hegemonic era after the Cold War, the United States, it could enjoy almost complete escalation control. It could escalate when you want it and de-escalate. So for example, it can give a bloody nose to other countries. It can bomb a little bit in Syria, bomb a little bit Iraq, and they know that the countries they're fighting, either they can't retaliate, but also they would be too fearful of retaliating. Because if they would launch something back at the United States, then the US would always have the threat of being able to do an even more powerful strike. So in other words, not just a bloody nose. Now it appears that Trump is trying to play this with the Iranians as well. That is, tell them, we'll hit you a little bit, but if you try to retaliate, we'll hit you a lot. Because as he attacked Iran, afterwards he said, well, now is the time for peace. And warned Iran against retaliation, as then America would hit them even harder. But if you're sitting in Toronto, you would conclude that yes, it's very dangerous to retaliate because you'll end up in a big war with America. But it could be even more dangerous not to retaliate, because then you set the precedent that now America can bomb you at will, and you just have to be quiet and compliant in order not to anger America more. So, what do you see coming from Iran? Are they going to go for some kind of measured, adequate response, or how? Well, what would you advise them, I guess? Or that's not a good framing, but what do you think they might do?
Oh, this is a very good question, and the whole issue, of course, is that, as you said, it's very a tricky question to react to such a power that has even launched wars for nothing. U.S. has a history of launching war for no reason, and but they lose them. It's also important to say, and the problem is that they don't learn from the lessons. That's a fascinating thing. I mean, neither Israel nor the US learn from their mistake. They repeat them. You know, there is a proverb in French that say everybody makes mistake, only the stupid repeat them. And we are exactly in this pattern with the US, which is quite strange. In any case, the problem here today is that we are in a different international configuration as before. Just take as an example the issue of Israel and Iran. Just keep the U.S. out of the equation for now. It's interesting that Israel is running out of the Arrow missile. The Arrow missile is built by Boeing in the U.S. Company. But to build this Arrow missile, they need rare earth and strategic minerals that are provided by China. Now, China has banned the export of these strategic material to aerospace and military military industries at large, meaning that Boeing cannot receive the strategic equipment or material or raw material needed to build those missiles. Meaning that now we are definitely in a situation where the US is not able to build or to produce the weapons that are needed for Israel. And we may have a similar thing with Iran. Now, we don't know exactly how will other powers react and how they will express their support to Iran, because that's also probably something that will play a role in the way Iran will respond to the US. But there will be a response, no doubt about this. But at the same time, Iran must respond without creating new enemies. You know, the Iran has now been accepted in the Middle East as a reintegrated the Conference of Islamic State and things like that. But again, all these ties are very fragile. And as you have noted, the attack that was launched against Iran has been based, has departed from Qatar and probably some other bases in the Middle East. Now, should Iran retaliate on these bases and therefore creating enemies among new friends? You know, this is something which will certainly play a role in the equation. But what can play also is the way other countries, such as Russia and China, respond to this. Because, and again, I'm not suggesting that China or Russia will respond or take an active part in Iran's response. But nevertheless, assuming that China decides that the problem are in the world is the US, which I think probably they have already in mind. I mean, the best way to stop the problem is just to make US to collapse. Now, making US collapsing is extremely simple because you just have to dump all the debt, the US debt that is detained by China. If you dump that, you will see the US to collapse completely within days. That will have, of course, consequences and impact on other countries, including China itself. And that's why I don't expect China to react instinctively and emotionally to that. But what I mean is that the US is not invisible anymore. It has inherent weaknesses based on its own economy, which is weak, which is highly dependent from countries such as, especially China, but not only. It's also highly dependent on the Middle East. And its foreign policy, which has decisively supported Israel for decades, is also dependent on the Middle East. Therefore, there is a lot of cards to play. What is still an unknown to me at this stage is how will the Middle Eastern community, I mean, Arab state, Iran not being an Arab state, as you know, but how will Arab states react to this situation? Because they have to realize that if they don't realize, it will show a weakness of Iran, that's true, but it will also show the weakness of these countries. Because so far, the US has maintained its hegemony, especially in this area, by the use of force. It's a mafia-like type of hegemony. If you don't do what I want, I strike. And that's exactly what Trump has done in Iran. It has even struck Iran before an agreement was made, uh, in order to achieve what he wants. And remember that in a diplomatic processes, a negotiation is precisely a process in which on both sides come with different positions and postures, and through negotiation you try to bring those two positions closer and closer until you reach a common position. That's the idea of negotiation. So it's a process, but Trump doesn't see that way. He sees a negotiation a way to bring the others to obey to US orders. And it's not how this works between sovereign countries. So it's a fundamental misconception of the US, of international relations. And my personal view is that we should, at one point, show the US that this is not the way international order works. And of course, I'm talking now out of myself without any other consideration. But if I had the freedom of decision, I would send a deadly blow to the US so that they understand that no, this international relations are not a joke. It's not the rule of Mr. Trump. I again, this is something which is obviously not something that Iran will do and any other country will do, but the destroying the Pentagon would be an adequate response in order to show let's stop that. As with Israel, I would do exactly the same, not destroy the whole population, so it's not, but to destroy the essential element of decision. That's a little bit what the Iranians have tried to do or engage in with Israel, but again, it's beyond the point. Again, nobody will do that because the consequence can be enormous, but these countries need to be put at their right place. They need to understand that they are not the world's rulers. And I completely understand that what I said is extreme. It's an extreme formulation, again. But the spirit is this one, that we should explain or let them understand that they cannot rule the world. And the international order that has been established after 1945 with the establishment of the UN, with in fact not the creation because international law was already there, but let's say the creation of an international law based order, not rules based order, but law based order that emerged from the Second World War must be maintained and must be reestablished. We should ban all the expressions as rule-based order, because the rules are defined by whoever, and this is the rule of the strongest, and this is not the way the international law-based order was designed. That's exactly why the UN are, with all their drawbacks, that's the way, the reason why the UN were made or created that way, in order to have a forum where everybody can exchange, can um, uh, explain its own idea, and everybody is equal in the same organization. It has been distorted by the US. I would even say hijacked by the US, because, of course, it's a highest, the biggest contributor, and therefore it has taken a lot of privilege within the organization. I've spent 4 years with the UN, and I know that this is a problem in the UN, that because they pay everything, then of course all the best positions are for the US, and therefore they have literally hijacked the organization. That was not the idea at the beginning, and we should come back to the original idea of the UN in order to retrieve this an order which is based on equality of members, to respect the interest of the different members, and to respect the law, the international law that everybody has agreed upon, has accepted and signed upon and ratified when it comes to treaty. Now, and that's exactly the problem. Now, if they don't understand that, they have to bring back to the level that they need to understand this. That's why I was talking about distraction, and again, I'm not suggesting that we Iran, and they will probably not do that, because they are much more um, they think much more about what they do. I mean, they are not emotional. But what I mean with that is that they must be brought back in a situation where they cannot do anything else than complying with international law. That should be my response if I were Iran. And I think, if you look at the strategy that Iran has used with Israel recently, in the past week, we see that it's exactly how Iran has reacted. They were not trying to destroy Israel. They were not trying to do as the Israeli systematically do, to aim the civilian population. The Iranians have systematically selected military or decision-making objectives, very limited in scope, very precise objectives, in order to disrupt the command and control of the country. And they have attacked also energy infrastructure in order to disrupt the economic, to bring them to a point of weakness where Israel understand that it cannot continue to fight because it's too weak to fight, and then to bring them to the point that they have to ask for the application of international law. And I think that the strategy of the Iranians is extremely wise, in fact. And I think this is exactly what we should do with the US, to make every effort to limit the scope of the power of the US. That could be economic weapon, if I can use the word weapon, or instruments. It can be political ones. It can be military ones also. But to bring them to the point that they realize that they could also be protected by international law. And I think that's where a good strategy should lead us to.
I just, it does seem like a key problem here is the mentality which is built up over the past few decades under this global primacy, the unipolar order. That is, you can do anything you want, and there's no consequences. You do it with impunity. I think this is the difficulty in adjusting to this new world because in a multipolar world, the actions taken in the unipolar world would be just yeah, insane or disastrous. And you see this now, this idea that you can just bomb the nuclear facilities of Iran and not having a pushback. But I did find it interesting what you said, though, that Iran does take its reputation into consideration because one of the things that has really changed over the past 2 years, at least, is that Israel is more alone now. That is, we now see in Israel after 2 years of genocide with, again, large support from the West. And now, of course, this surprise attack in the middle of negotiations, and then Trump says, "Okay, we need 2 weeks to decide." Then they do an attack. I mean, they already that's not, that's very hard to have sympathy for the unprovoked aggression which is happening. So I can see why they wouldn't want to spoil some of their new relationships, but at the same time, attacks are coming from some of their so-called new friends. So I was just wondering what are the most likely targets? Because if they go after American bases, you will destroy relations with the countries which are hosting the bases. Would Iran limit itself to attacks on American ships? Because you mentioned the Pentagon, but the geographical reach, I don't think it. I think they would stay regional in this sense, but what also that would elicit too powerful of a response from America. But what are the likely targets? Do you see
Well,
everyone always points to the Strait of Hormuz, for example, shut down
well,
international commerce, but then they might annoy the Chinese, you know, so and the Indians. So what are good targets, I guess, for Iran?
First of all, Iran has already stated that if it gets attacked, it would take measure to limit or even block the traffic on the Strait of Hormuz. But, they can do exactly the same as the Houthis did. The Houthis didn't block every or fire at any ships that was in the Red Sea. It attacked exclusively those who were bound to Eilat in the south of Israel, in the port of Israel. So um, the Houthis were extremely selective in their way of doing. They had decided on an embargo against Israel, and they enforced this embargo simply, as the U.S. does. By the way, they applied exactly the same principles that the U.S. and the West does. I mean, you declare an embargo and you enforce it. And of course, they don't have a navy, therefore they enforce it with missiles. But in essence, that's exactly what they did, and they bombed exclusively those ships that were bound to Israel. So we can have exactly a similar approach here, meaning that it's not about closing completely the Strait of Hormuz, but simply to prohibit any circulation between Hormuz or the Persian Gulf and and the U.S., for instance, or U.S. interest, or things like that, to prevent any logistical support, for instance, of the U.S. in the region, and things like this. By the way, there are other areas such as Iraq, for instance, where you have bases, U.S. bases, and I'm not sure that the Iraqis are extremely keen to have those bases. So we might have the discussion might be a slightly different with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who have demonstrated in the past their willingness to engage in or to facilitate diplomatic ties between Iran and the West and things like this. So probably it would not be very wise to strike any target on those territories. But when it comes to Iraq, well, or Syria, well, you could do that. Of course, with the risk of having heavy retaliations from the U.S. But at the same time, when you have hypersonic missiles, then a fleet, especially the fleet that has been now gathered around the Middle East by Trump, by taking fleets from all over the world to gather around the Middle East, a fleet becomes a very juicy target for hypersonic missiles, even if it's not as easy as we can think, because even if the hypersonic missiles are very fast, it would, in theory at least, it would be still possible for even for a carrier, aircraft carrier, to evade this threat. But this is the technicalities of it. But in fact, those fleets are very juicy targets, and if they would be hit by several, if you have a salvo of 10 or 20 missiles on an aircraft carrier group, that would create severe damage and probably help Trump to think about using military force. So I don't know. Again, I don't know. I don't know up to which point the Iranians are ready to take the risk of having a frontal retaliation against the US. Again, the other unknown factor is also how other countries will react. Because what you just said is correct. Trump is extremely unpopular in Europe and in the world, basically. Um, Israel is extremely unpopular. I mean, the unpopularity of Israel, and that's also an important factor, not just Israel, but the Jews have become extremely unpopular everywhere. And if you look at the statistics that you have almost everywhere, you have anti-Semitic acts multiplied everywhere. So the international community, I mean, the diaspora, the Jewish, might also play a role in that. I mean, they have not played a big role so far, and probably not even played a negative role. But in the future, we may have different perception of that, because what we have seen on the 13th of June and yesterday is a blatant violation of international law. You cannot, it's totally unprovoked and demonstrably unprovoked and demonstrably unjustified. So we have used those two words to define the Russian intervention in Ukraine, and we have systematically used those two words because we wanted to uh, emphasize, or not emphasize, but to declare this Russian intervention as illegal. It's beyond the point today. I will not discuss that. My view is that the reason why we used those two words was precisely because the, the Russian intervention was both justified and provoked. But here, in the case of Iran, we have a truly unprovoked and truly unjustified intervention for an issue, and Kaya Kallas just demonstrated that, for an issue which was not even at stake, because it's not the question of for Iran to have a nuclear bomb. It is just its right to enrich uranium for civilian purposes, period. And that is something that has been established, which is widely recognized, and therefore there is absolutely no justification whatsoever for the both attacks from Israel and the US today, which are probably the most despised uh, countries, and certainly the most despised leaders. I mean, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, the most despised leaders in the world, well beyond everything we have known before.
Yeah, this is what they have achieved, and it's no, it's just yeah, astonishing that they went to this to this extent, and yeah, now that they actually made Iran seem like the responsible uh, power, while all the Western ones are seen now as backing this unconditionally, it is quite concerning. My last question was about was related to the possible involvement of other external actors. Now, people often point to Russia and China, but a country which is often referred to as well is Pakistan as another nuclear power. Again, they have their tensions at times with Iran, but they also have their, I guess, tensions with Israel. And there's been, people have been making the arguments that, yeah, Pakistan would perhaps assist Iran with intercepting missiles, which would be close to its borders if, well, under an attack on Iran. Uh, Others have argued that Pakistan could, under some conditions, transfer a nuclear weapon to Iran, which I find more doubtful. But the former seems more likely. I was wondering, what is your take on this? The possible involvement of Pakistan in this war?
They have threatened to use nuclear weapons against Israel if Iran was attacked. Now, obviously, again, I don't know how Pakistanis feel about that, but my personal view is that we should have some kind of proportionality, and probably the Pakistan will not engage nuclear weapons if there is no proportional issue at stake, because using nuclear weapons has implications, not just for the target, but also for Pakistan itself. No, but probably what we can have, and which is related to this issue, is something that has been suggested many times in the recent days, is that Iran could withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore giving a signal that now they would engage into another type of strategy. This is what happened with North Korea. When North Korea developed also ballistic missiles, and they were accused of having nuclear weapons, and were threatened of strikes by the U.S. So what they decided to get out of the NPT and to develop nuclear weapons. And now North Korea is quiet because they have nuclear weapons somehow. So we might have a similar behavior from Iran. I don't know. Again, this is a matter of national policy. The Iranians have consistently resisted this idea so far, but now that they are actively provoked, literally, they might decide to get out of the NPT, but getting out of the NPT might also attract new operations from the US. So, and there is also something that we have to take into account. The Israelis in the first phase, and probably the US also, were expecting uh, uprising in Iran and a destabilization of the government and all that. This didn't happen, and there was even in on the Israeli media some saying that, well, in fact, they were surprised to see that Iran was surprisingly stable, and the stability of the country was not affected by what happened. So we have to wait. But there are other forces that have not been at play so far, but could be at play, which are all these resistance movements that we have in the Kurdistan. I mean, Kurds in the north, the Hawazi in the south, in the southwest, the Baluch in the south, and which are, we know that the West is having contact with those movements, arming those movements, and probably can trigger some kind of civil war, something exactly the same pattern as we have seen in Syria. So this is also something that we may see. So Iranians are probably aware of that, and therefore their freedom of movement or reaction in that scheme is extremely narrow. But they will, as I agree with you, they have to respond, and they need to respond. What I would suggest is that other countries should also respond and to demonstrate the US that you cannot just breach the international law in the middle of the negotiation process, because that's what Israel has done last week and what the US has done this week, meaning that then how can we trust any negotiation or diplomatic process if you know that if the the the, the way this negotiation is going may simply trigger a military reaction? So what's the point having a diplomatic ties? So that the international community should also react to that, in my view, and some way, probably not militarily, but certainly by sending very strong political signal that will not come from the EU, but that may come from individual states. And that's absolutely needed against Israel, definitely, and against the US also, because now we have, unipolarity or multipolarity is not a policy. This is a status of things. I mean, and if you read this famous interview of Marco Rubio and Megyn Kelly on CBS, or some, he said that. I mean, unipolarity was the result of a situation that emerged after the end of the Cold War. The problem is not unipolarity or multipolarity. The problem is your strategy of hegemony. Hegemony is a strategy, or is element of a strategy or a policy. And that is the key aspect. And even if you are in the unipolar world, you can opt for not having a policy of hegemony. But the US has chosen to do that. So unipolarity is given by the condition. But hegemony, and that's exactly what we have witnessed here, both in for the Ukrainian conflict, what we will certainly see in China, and what we are seeing now in the Middle East, is a policy of hegemony. And that also shows that Trump is not different from the others. He has just another way to approach an hegemonic policy, but in essence, he has exactly the same mentality as the others. He put forward more the trade and economic aspect of hegemony rather than the military ideological aspect, as Biden and Obama did. But in essence, we are talking about the same product, which is the US should rule the world. And that is something that we cannot accept. And therefore, I I would suggest that other countries should also intervene and react vigorously against this kind of behavior, because then we are in the law of the jungle, and that's exactly where we are.
Yeah, I think that wider context is important because I've seen the same way, or interpreted the conflict, the proxy war in Ukraine the same way. That is, the world is being pulled in two directions because we're having this shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, as you correctly say. That's an issue of the distribution of power. What matters is how policies are adjusted to these realities. And you see the vast majority of the world preferring multipolarity, seeking to accommodate this. And the US with its, I guess, NATO allies are trying to push and back to restore the unipolar moment. And I think this is a big part of the war against Russia, but now also the war against Iran. And it will also be the next war against China. And I think it's a very disastrous war for the West. So anyways, yeah, Colonel Baud, thank you so much for your time. I'm yeah, glad you could come on right after this immense disaster. So thanks
No
again.
problem. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for that. Thank you.